Your name and how old you are now and how old you were in 1998.
Okay. My name is Herman Wright Jr. I'm 57 years old, and I was 45 in 1998.
Okay. So you were able to assess that pretty quickly. Do you just remember how old you were at that time, just because of the significance of the Jasper Dragon?
Well, I'm a bit of a writer, and so that time frame is very important to me. I think a lot happened in Jasper that was a huge shift for the community. I know for me it was a huge shift. It was sort of an event where you sort of went, what happened before this that led up to that, and what happens now as we go past that.
So you just remember I was 45 when that happened, and that was a big year for Jasper.
Well, it was a big year for Jasper, and you know, I was a 45-year-old working person with a career, and you know, it was a time for reflection about, you know, how far I had come, the shoulders that I stood on, the progress that had been made that probably wouldn't have been possible 30 years before. And so, you know, when you look at an event like that, for better or worse, it causes you to stop and to basically say, okay, where am I on this planet?
Okay. So tell me what you were doing at that time and what you're doing today.
In 1998, I was a senior vice president for a healthcare company, big national Fortune 500 company in Chicago. I had gone to school. I kind of followed my dad's path in the military, came out of the military, went into corporate sales, then what became a marketing guy, became an executive, and we were living, you know, for my daughters, I have two daughters, a fairly charmed life on the North Shore in Chicago. And so, to a large extent, my parents were very proud of me. And then, all of a sudden, the reality of life, East Texas, came back to greet me. And, you know, for me, I had nothing but, I won't say I had nothing but positive, but I had a positive mindset about where I'd come from. We actually owned a home here in East Texas. My dad's ranch, which I've taken over since his death, has been in our family for 140 years. And so I had a lot of markers that told me that, you know, life is to a certain extent what you make it. And so for me, this event was a huge, I guess this doesn't really adequately describe it, but for me it was a huge outlier. It was like outside. I was like going, why here? Why now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, and tell me what you're doing today.
I've taken over my family's ranch. So
what year did you take it over?
I took it over really about 8 years ago when my dad became ill. And I had to make a decision as to whether I would continue the legacy. And I decided there was a lot to that legacy. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit that I formed in 2006 called alongblackline.org. We've raised, you know, about $50,000 that we've given to schools and cultural organizations to really tell the history of African Americans, particularly in the 1920s to 1930s, when there was a huge education movement that really lifted millions of African Americans up across the country, and over 500 wooden schoolhouses were built in Texas alone. And 4 of those are still standing in Jasper County. And so my job is to let people know that there was this period of empowerment back in the 1920s and 30s, that people need to be aware that these weren't cardboard characters. This wasn't just the Jim Crow South, and these were these poor, pitiful people. These people actually built schools and basically put their kids through it. My dad went to one of those schools, and he turned out, you know, he went into the military, and my mom graduated from one of those schools, and she became a teacher, and he became a military officer. And so I owe a lot to my grandmother's initiative to help get that school built and to make sure her boys went through it, even though she had, like many African Americans back then, no more than a primary school education. So it's a powerful story, and I formed this nonprofit. I'm a research fellow at Stephen F. Austin State University with their Center for Regional Heritage. I'm a public historian, so I spend a lot of time interacting with the faculty to be able to tell these stories that come from these communities.
Okay. And so 4 of those schools are in Jasper County.
4 of them are in Jasper County, and I like to say this because that brings me to my next career. I like to say this, or to my career, is that I believe that there is really no county in Texas that has more of these schools still standing than in Jasper County. And we have something called the Long Black Line Tour, where 4 times a year we take people from across the country come in and take the tour to look at these standing school buildings. And we've had over 1,000 people. And in fact, on the courthouse care where you were there, they meet, they drive in, we go through about a 70-mile tour and go visit these schools.
Wow.
Yeah.
How long has the organization been in existence?
The Long Black Line?
Yes.
For 5 years formally as a 501c3 nonprofit.
Great.
And you know, I had a vision on this, or I was motivated by one story, which was I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. I ultimately ended up restoring my grandparents' home.
Okay, great. And is that in Jasper?
That's actually in Mount Union, Texas, on our ranch, which is about 50 miles from here.
Okay.
And my grandmother was this force of nature. And so her father was a master carpenter, and what I did was shored up my great-grandfather's home, my grandfather's birthplace, my father's birthplace, and that's where I stay.
Okay. So did you do a lot of the work yourself, or
No. I used people from the community, relatives who knew how to do the work. It was really a community project because so many people in the family, and there's about 2,000 acres that's owned by still family members who are descendants of Benjamin Wright.
That's awesome.
It is awesome. We actually have a meeting hall.
So that people can't sell the property, or are people allowed?
You know, we don't have anything that prevents anyone from selling, other than we have this voice that comes from 150 years back, which basically says, if you're going to sell, sell to a family member. And as a result, we've been able to keep this land basically together. And this land is actually, it's a fairly powerful story. It starts with 2 Scottish brothers in 1815 who came from Mississippi and fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, came to North Texas with their father, came down here, and in 1835 secured a Spanish land grant called the Sheridan-Alexander Wright League. Then they began the process. We believe that they had about 20 slaves that they had acquired in Louisiana and that they brought. And in 1865, when the war ended, they separated half of their land and deeded it to the slave families, of which my great-grandfather was one of those.
Okay, and they just held on to it.
And they have held on to it. Now, the interesting thing is that for the Sheridan-Alexander Wright family, the whole process of advancement and all that, that land has gone away, and we have maintained. So, to a certain extent, I think that Jim Crow, one of its advantages, if that can be said that it is an advantage, is that it forced us to stay on the land. And so we had to make do. And what we've done is we've had a commitment to make that prejudice, that racism work for us to a positive advantage. And actually, we've had relations with the other white Wrights, and they're equally as proud of what's happening, because they now see a right is still attached to the land.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Good story. Okay, and you said you were going to segue into what you...
Well, yeah, for 25 years, you know, that didn't pay the bills.
Okay.
And I was after the Army, I became a sales guy and then a marketing guy. I went to a variety of graduate courses and turned myself into a marketing executive. And so that's what I spent over 20 years being a guy who's got a real expertise around sales, branding, and communication. And that has formed a lot of how I sort of look at the world.
Miss Joy or Bonnie, these are one of them.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Okay. All right. So now we'll move on to some of our other questions. So what made you leave Jasper? I guess did you go off?
Well, the fact of the matter is that I traveled around the world. I never really, as I said, planted myself in Jasper. I was never planted in Jasper. I was an Army kid. We lived everywhere from Hawaii to Central America to Africa, and that was where my dad. So my dad's exposure from being a barefoot kid in the woods to being in the embassies in West Africa was quite a journey for him. And we had a wonderful relationship. I mean, you know, as a father, he was also my best friend, and so we had a talking relationship that went on for all of my life until he became ill. And so my marketing background has infused sort of how I see, and my background as a Army kid has basically brought me to this point where, one, I was so tied to the story and the narrative of East Texas that I willed myself to become a rancher and to learn that business and to learn how to do that, and also to come back and make sure that, despite the fact of living in Chicago and LA and New York and all these places, that I always had a place that I could say, this is where I am. So I always made a point of coming back to town, getting to know people such as Walter Diggles and the mayor, R.C. Horn, and others. And I also had one other formative experience.
And what was that?
Probably the most interesting thing I would say about my life. In 1968, I had been on Army post all my life. The Army had desegregated in 1948, so it was a very interesting experience outside of Maine society. In 68, Dad went to Vietnam, and I came back home to Jasper, and it was still segregated. And I went to a segregated school, J.H. Rowe.
Culture shock.
You know something? It was not culture shock.
You were
Kathy,
expecting
you
that?
call one of one.
Sorry. It was not culture shock because I had basically been the lone African American in so many places that all of a sudden I was with family. You know, whether there were inequities in the educational system, but it was the best year that I had ever had. 1 year while he was in Vietnam.
So it was you and your mother, and how many siblings?
Well, my mother went to California. She didn't want anything to do with it. So I stayed with my grandparents, just me and my grandparents. The thing that I remember is the day integration happened. And all of a sudden, we were integrated into the white school.
What year was that?
In
Miss
1969.
Bonnie, give a call on 102. Kathy, give a call on 102.
As a result of court-ordered desegregation, they slammed us in. And I was the only black student who actually had never